and good afternoon. Welcome to the Structuralist Macroeconomics Development Group webinar. Today, we're honored to have Professor Fernando Rugitsky from the University of São Paulo and the University of the West of England, Bristol, here to present his article called Rentier Income and Mass-Based Financialization, the Limits of Redistributive Policies During the Pink Tide in Brazil. Professor Rugitsky is a professor at the Department of Economics at the University of São Paulo, FEA USP, and a senior lecturer at the University of the West of England, Bristol. In 2020, he was a visiting scholar at the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge. He holds a PhD in economics from the New School of Social Research in the United States, and a master's degree in economic law from USP, and a bachelor's degree in economics and law from the same institution. He's currently researching the relationship between economic growth, income distribution, and structural dynamics in the recent trajectory of Brazil and other South American countries. His work has been published in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, in books and journals such as the Cambridge Journal of Economics, the Review of Radical Political Economics, and the Review of Political Economy, and the Review of Keynesian Economics. The presentation is expected to last approximately 15 minutes, and Professor Oreiro, the head of our research group, will later serve as the debater. At the conclusion of the presentation, Professor Oreiro will deliver his comments, followed by a discussion in which general questions and concerns from the public will be addressed via chat. I now invite Professor Oreiro and Professor Rugitsky to join me. Welcome.
Hello.
We hope. Hello.
Hello, Fernando.
We hope.
Hello. I'm not sure if you can see me or if you can see my presentation, but I'm here.
No, we are seeing you.
We can see.
Okay, great.
We hope you enjoyed the seminar. Professor Rugitsky, you may begin your exposition now.
Right. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Isadora, for the kind presentation. Thank you a lot, Oreiro, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share my recent research results with you, and I'm looking forward to debating those topics with you, to hearing your questions, and to establish this dialogue. So, in the interest of time, to go straight to the topic, this research is something I've been working on with Pedro Marques from the University of São Paulo for a few years now, and we've wrote a couple of papers on the topic. And I'll try to summarize the main results we've obtained so far with you today. In order to do so, I'll just motivate this research in the beginning. Then I'll go through some of the theoretical background of our research and discuss in a little bit more detail the data that we use and the definitions that we use for our empirical estimation, and then I'll focus on the results themselves, the functional distribution that we arrived for Brazil for the period from 2000 to 2019, and our general interpretation of the political economy of the distributive conflict in Brazil in those last 2 decades. So just to begin with, to make sure we're all on the same page, our main contribution here is to try to devise a more broad definition of the functional distribution of income. As many of you may be aware, it's very usual in the heterodox literature in general to work with the functional distribution of income. There is the distribution of income between the wage share and the profit share, between wages and profits, but we try to expand that usual functional distribution of income to bring in the rentiers, and in this way we present these estimates of this broader functional distribution of income for Brazil. And in light of these results, of this 4 shares actually, because we include the rentiers and the government share as well. In light of these 4 shares and their trajectory throughout these last 2 decades, we try to offer some interpretation of the nature of the distributive conflict and the nation of the political economy of the period in general. So, as a motivation for this research, we all know that there is a growing literature on rising working class indebtedness and distributive conflict, but this literature is especially focused on global north country. There's not a lot of work so far focused on the capitalist periphery. It is, of course, well established that working class indebtedness has been a significant feature of our world economy in the last few decades, and it has impacted distributive conflict. But the specific way in which this connection may be found in peripheral countries like Brazil is something that haven't been examined so far, to the best of our knowledge. Regarding the Brazilian case itself, it's kind of a cliche to say that Brazil is a rentier's paradise. We know that we have had for long periods of our history one of the highest interest rates in the world, and of course we continue to be one of the most unequal countries in the world. So not exactly criticizing this cliche, but trying to build a firmer, say, empirical ground for this argument. We try to assess in which sense we can think about Brazil as a rentier's paradise. There is, of course, a large literature, especially in the last few years, on the financialized character of capital accumulation in Brazil. And in different dimensions of Brazilian financialization, looking at exchange rate, looking at monetary policy, looking at the financialization of non-financial corporations. But so far, this literature hasn't focused as much as we think it should on the implications of this financialized character of capital accumulation to distributive conflict. So that's the gap we're trying to fill. That's the contribution we aim to give. Just a short spoiler of what we're going to discuss here. The main results we find is that the share of rentier income in Brazil as a share of Brazilian GDP has fluctuated around a slightly increasing trend in the last 2 decades, even though its composition has changed profoundly. The wage share of income net of interest payments has fallen almost continuously between 2001 and 2011. This is, every time we present this research, this is usually the most controversial point we make, because it's very well established in the literature that the wage share of income has increased during Lula's first 2 governments, with and on the back of several of pro-labor policies adopted at that period, from hikes in minimum wages to the increasing social transfers and so on and so forth. But and of course we don't debate the precision of those estimates of the wage share of income when considered in general. But when we deduct from the wage share of income the interest payments done by workers to rentiers, that trajectory is completely inverted, and we see a reduction of the wage share of income from 2001 to 2011. We will go through more details on our methodology, but it effectively means that the money that was being channeled towards the working classes through pro-labor, pro-worker policies was, with the other hand, being taken out of the working classes and shifted through rentiers through increasing process of financial expropriation, which were, market as policies of financial inclusion at the time, but just, in our view, consolidated and entrenched structures of income inequality by channeling again a continuous flow of income from poorer sections of the population to the richer sections of the population, the rentiers. And a third result that we find that we would like to highlight is that we can identify in the period in the years 2012 and 2013 substantial rentier squeeze, which in our view is very crucial to understand the political economy conflicts in that critical conjuncture in Brazil, in which the seeds of the subsequent political regression were sowed. So in first Dilma Rousseff's government. But we'll go in much more detail through those three results. So before going to the data, our attempt to think about the functional income distribution in a broader way beyond capital and labor and bringing rentiers in has, of course, a long tradition in heterodox economics. It goes back to Marx himself, when in volume 3 of Capital, he talks about a qualitative division for the capitalist class as a whole. And he distinguishes between functioning capitalists and money capitalists or rentiers. The literature on this specific part of volume 3 of Capital, and the part that Marx talks about interest income and profit of enterprise and the nature of those financial flows, is vast. But our main point is that there is a well-established literature that points to the significance of this division of two main factions within the capitalist class. So the functioning capitalists on the one hand, and the money capitalists or rentiers on the other hand, as two main factions of the capitalist class. In Kaletsky's work, the seminal paper on the political aspects of full employment, the famous 1943 paper, as you may remember, he does adopt that same division of a tripartite, if we could call it like that, functional division of income, thinking through the distributive conflict between workers, rentiers, and capitalists. And he makes that interesting point, which is one of the starting points of our argument, that during the cyclical distributive conflict, when labor markets get tight during the boom phase of the cycle, unemployment falls, workers get higher bargaining power, manage to get higher wage increases. These wage increases, according to Kaletsky's usual assumption, are passed on through to prices, as firms are considered by Kaletsky to be able to maintain their profit margins, and this leads to inflation. And inflation, in the end, negatively impact rentiers' income, according to Kaletsky's readings, in a way that leads rentiers to be boom tired, as he says. And it's and in this narrative, that's sometimes not the most the part of his argument that is most often focused on. In this part of his argument, he's claimed that the capitalists would turn against full employment policies, because even though they would be there would be an advantage for them of full employment policies in terms of profitability, they are concerned with the political implications of full employment. Kaletsky makes the additional point that at this point of the cycle, the rentiers will ally with the capitalists. The capitalists, because of the political concerns with full employment. The rentiers, because they are boom tired, they will be in alliance against full employment policies, asking for austerity and unleashing what he called the political business cycle. There is, of course, a large literature that followed on Kaletsky's footsteps on that regard. We mentioned especially the classic paper by Refford Body and Jim Crotty, in which they try to combine Kaletsky's and Marx's insight on that topic. Jerry Epstein has also made several contributions along those lines, rethinking that tripartite distributive conflict by incorporating exchange rate regimes and other details that weren't in the original framework. In the most recent efforts by both Sraffians and post-Keynesians to think through that tripartite distributive conflict, you see also some other steps that were made in the direction of thinking in more, say, complex ways how this tripartite conflict plays out. So the Sraffians introduce the crucial role of interest rate as a determinant of profitability, of rentier income, and of distribution in general. The works of Pivetti and Panico are good illustrations of that effort. And in post-Keynesian models, there are also several attempts to think through the role of rentiers in growth and distribution in general. So that's the background for our own research. There is, of course, something that is always raised when we present this finding. There is widespread suspicion on considering in contemporary capitalist conditions the division between functioning capitalists and rentiers, with the argument that those roles are increasingly overlapping in contemporary capitalist economies. As, for example, individual capitalists alternate between the two roles, as joint stock companies, as Marx himself put it, transform the actual functioning capitalist into a mere manager and the capital owner into a mere owner, a mere money capitalist. So there's a long tradition as well of thinking that these two factions of the capitalist class are not as easily identifiable as it may be thought in the first place. Currently, the process of financialization entails growing shares of non-financial corporations owned by financial institutions, which make for another overlapping of these two categories. But we do think that despite those complexities and the nuances involved in this distinction, there is, in specific places and in specific contexts, in the case of Brazil in the last 20 years, in specific critical conjunctures, there is an identifiable struggle between conflicting factions of the capitalists, in which, some of those capitalists may alternate between the two roles, may receive at the same time rentier income and profit of enterprise, but the struggles do appear to consolidate between factions of those groups that do dispute on policy decisions and on the overall distribution of income. And independently if this distinction is or is not fruitful or identifiable, our research would still be useful just if we think not in terms of factions of the capitalist class, but if we think about factions or shares of capitalist income that alternate through time. So thinking about the role that rentier income may play for interclass conflict, that is the conflict between capitalists in general and labor, may still be influenced by the shifting shares of rentier income, independently if there are an identifiable division within the capitalist class. Right, so I think that's more than enough for theoretical background. Let's look at some data. So we are building here on mainly two bodies of previous empirical work. One is the research led by Jerry Epstein and his co-authors, mainly at UMass Amherst. Those papers that you can see, the references there. And the other body of work are papers by Petra Dunhaupt and her co-authors, Eckhard Hein and other German post-Keynesian economists. So those two body of works were both attempts to estimate rentier income. They are somewhat different in their approach, and our own approach tried to combine different aspects of the two. So there is one previous estimate of rentier income with Brazilian data by Miguel Bruno and Café, but their research is a little bit different from ours, and raises a little bit different questions. So in the present paper, the definitions that we adopt are the following. We considered both the profits and the property income that flow to the financial sector as part of rentier income, following Epstein and his co-authors. So that's different from the research by Dunhaupt and her co-authors, in which they consider the whole income going to the financial firms as part of profits, and only property income going to households as rentier income. In this regard, we follow Epstein's decision of considering the whole income flowing to the financial firms as part of rentier income, including both profits for those firms and property income. We divide national income into 4 shares, as I mentioned: wages, profits of enterprise, rentier income, and government income. And this allows us to make explicit the expanded distributive conflict. In this regard, we're following Dunhaupt, because Epstein and his co-authors, they don't try to actually provide a whole functional distribution of income, but just the rentier income share. But Dunhaupt and her co-authors do try to present an encompassing functional distribution of income as we do. And the last thing that it's controversial in this literature is how to place dividends. So Dunhaupt and her co-authors place dividends as part of rentier income, but we follow Epstein's decision of considering that whereas interest should be placed in rentier income, dividends are a form of profit of enterprise, so we attribute that to profit of enterprise. That wouldn't change significantly the results. It would change the levels a little bit of the shares, but not the trajectory too much. And we can talk a little bit more about that later if you want. The main actually contribution of our empirical estimate to this larger literature is the incorporation of the idea of financial expropriation. That is defined by Lapavitsas, for example, and adopted by other authors, as the extraction of financial profit directly out of personal income of workers. As you're probably aware, financial profit in Marxian political economy is usually thought to be a share of surplus value that financial firms appropriate to themselves. So financial firms are appropriating a share of surplus value. The idea of financial expropriation is trying to describe the fact that part of financial profit seems to come in current capitalist conditions, not as a part of surplus share appropriated, but directly out of the personal income of workers, as if there's a debate on the relationship between expropriation and exploitation in that literature, but as if the financial profits were extracted directly from the workers and not from other factions of the capitalist class. We don't get into the controversy on the, say, larger theoretical meaning of financial expropriation, but our empirical results seem to suggest that the phenomenon of financial expropriation is crucial to contemporary distributive conflict and to the Brazilian case in particular. There are, of course, several limitations, mainly due to data availability in our approach, the way we incorporate government is not as encompassing as one may prefer. We can't really incorporate capital gains, which is a very important part of rentier income. For lack of data, we only have data for that for a shorter period, and it's very volatile. We're thinking how to incorporate that for future research. And our distinction between capitalist and worker households is somewhat simplified and could probably be improved in future research. So just to be clear on our definitions, we get data from national accounting statistics. Wage income is mainly employees' compensation, as you can see here in this third column, plus a share of gross mixed income following Douglas Golling well accepted and established method of dividing gross mixed income between wages and profit, less interest income paid by households. So we're considering here that all interest income paid by households are paid by worker households. And on the other hand, all interest income received by households are received by rentier households. That's the division that we're trying to suggest. And of course, that could be improved in future research. So wage income is employee compensation, a share of gross mixed income, less interest income paid. Rentier income is the gross operating surplus of the financial firms, that is both profits and property income. Oh no, sorry, that's profit, right? Properties here. Net property income of financial firms plus interest income received by households. Profits of enterprise are aggregate gross operating surplus, net of financial firms operating surplus and government operating surplus, the remaining share of gross mixed income, and aggregate net profit income deducted of the net profit income of financial firms, net property income of the government, and interest income paid and received by households. And the government income, finally, is gross operating surplus of the government, net taxes, and net property income by the government. Right. We can go into more detail about that if you think that would be useful. So here you can see our results for the period from 2000 to 2019. The red line here is wage share, as I mentioned earlier. In contrast to the conventional measures of the wage share, our wage share, when we deduct interest income paid, goes down all the way to 2011. And we'll talk about why it goes up afterwards. We see that decline in the wage share of income is partly compensated by a respective increase in rentier income and some increase in the government income share. At the same time, the profit of enterprise income share also falls. In the period of Dilma Rousseff's first government, as I mentioned, we can see a significant rentier squeeze here from 2011 to 2013. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And well, we're going to talk a little bit about all this period. So, and here we have the numbers so that we can have a better sense of what's going on. So let's talk about this 5 distinct periods and what our data suggests about them. Well, I won't focus in the first period, actually. If you go back to the data, you see that there is a lot of volatility in the first years of our sample, second government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and we attribute mostly this volatility to the overall economic volatility and crisis of the period, and we think that the actual political economy of distributive conflict becomes more meaningful and interesting to interpret in the following period. So the first period that we focus on is a period mostly comprising Lula's first two governments up to 2011, not 2010, because it's dated up to the end of the commodity boom. As you know, the commodity prices stopped increasing and started falling in mid 2011. So that period is characterized, as is well known, by a significant acceleration of economic growth and unusual for Brazilian standards labor market tightening. If you look at data for business cycles in Brazil and in Latin America in general, actually, and CEPAL has some very interesting research along those lines. Something that is striking is that business cycles tend to be much shorter in Latin America than if you compare to the length of business cycles in not only in the rich countries but also in other peripheral countries in Asia. So those short business cycles, which CEPAL attributes to truncated cyclical expansions, is usually explained by the profound foreign vulnerability of Latin American economy. So, whereas in most other countries, you can actually identify cyclical cycles in which the conventional explanation of the cycle along the lines of Marx and Goodwin and even post-Keynesian models following on the footsteps of Goodwin, in which you have a cyclical expansion with tightening of the labor market, profit squeeze, the cyclical reversion, the recomposition of the industrial reserve army of labor, recomposition of profits, and then a new cyclical expansion. Instead of having that in Latin America, you generally have those expansions cut short by foreign crises significantly before labor markets are actually tight. So the cyclical distributive trajectory that is expected from frameworks such as Goodwin's, just to mention the most famous one, is not seen commonly in Latin America and in Brazil in particular. In another piece of research that I did with another co-author, Guilherme Klein Martins, we actually measured those profit squeezes in a Brazilian business cycle since the mid 1990s, and the result that we find is that there was no profit squeezes in Brazil up to the 2000s, precisely because the earlier cyclical expansions were always cut short by foreign crises, right? But I'm saying all that, which is a bit of a digression on my exposition, to focus on the fact that in this period from 2004 to 2011, despite the significance of the 2008 crisis in between, Brazil went through, in a very unusual way, a very long expansion for Brazilian standards. Even the recession following the 2008 crisis didn't change significantly the trajectory of the variables. If you think about unemployment or distribution or consumption or investment, labor market resumed tightening right after the crisis, and of course measures of unemployment reached levels that are very unusual for Brazil. And this, in the beginning, this is one of the elements that are usually used to justify or to explain, to interpret the finding that we have a rising wage share of income in that period. right? What we found in our earlier research efforts is that in the beginning of that period, especially in the period up to the 2008 crisis, most of the increase in the wage share is actually due to a composition effect. Even though the economy was growing and pro-worker policies were being adopted and minimum wage hikes were being implemented by the government, unemployment was still at such a high level that you couldn't really think that there was a significant increase in the bargaining power of the workers. So most of the wage share increase that we observe in that first period up to 2008 is mostly due to the fact that sectors with above average wage share were growing faster than sectors with below average wage share. So a composition effect. But then after 2009, and especially in 2010 and 11, we do see some significant tightening in the labor market. In 2012 and 13, we see in the data a strike wave, the likes of which Brazil had not seen since the 1980s. So a very significant strike wave in terms of days lost to strikes or to workers involved in industrial action, and real wages start growing significantly, and the wage share grow within sectors. So the increase in the wage share is not only due to composition effect, but takes place within the sectors themselves. However, it is on that same period that we see labor market tightening, that long expansion, an increase in the bargaining power of workers, the period that ends with a strike wave. In that same period, we see a huge increase in working class indebtedness. So it begins with the legal authorization of automatic payments from the paycheck, what we call in Brazil crédito consignado, in 2004. That unleashed a wave of credit extension to working class households. If you look at central bank data, we see that most of credit extension, new credit contracts, were focused on the poorer sections of the population, and of course, part of that was simply the result of falling credit constraints. So the rising income in the bottom layers of Brazilian society allowed some people who had previously had not access to banking, banking services, to access banking services to this first time, and then to have access to credit. And of course, part of that process was positive in the sense that it allowed a lot of poorer households to access for the first time durable consumption goods that were beyond reach before that, household appliances and so on and so forth. But the longer term impact of that growing household indebtedness was, of course, as is well established in the theoretical literature, an entrenchment of the structures that reproduce inequality. And when we look at our data, we see that the increase in the employee compensation that account for the conventional measures of increasing the wage share is more than compensated by a rising increase in interest payments by worker households. So if you look at that data here, we see that the wage share of income that we generally see as rising in that period, it actually falls on the average from 2000 to 2003 to the average of the the 4 subsequent years, and then falls again up to 2011. Again, not because employee compensation is not growing, it is growing as a share of GDP, but that is more than compensated by interest payments. In the paper itself, you have the whole decomposition here that can show that in more detail. At that same period, from the point of view of rentiers, the story that we're telling for that period is that the rentiers are trying to adapt to a context of falling interest rates. So if you look at real interest rates, they fall from a level of 9.83% on average in the first Lula government to 5% on average in the second Lula government, and they would fall even further to 3% in Dilma's government, right? First government. So they are adapting to this process of falling real interest rate, which make them, squeeze the returns on loan extension. However, they more than compensate falling interest rates by the quantity of credit extended. So as price is pushing their income streams downwards, quantity is compensating upwards. So they are compensating the fact that they are receiving less interest payments from both non-financial corporations and from the government. So if you look at interest payments by the government, it falls continuously during this first period. If you look at interest payments by non-financial corporations to the financial firms, it also falls continuously to this throughout this period. But this is more than compensated by growing interest payments by households to rentiers, right? So financial expropriation plays a crucial role to explain the growing share of rentier income that we see in this period. When we look at the composition of rentier income, it's striking that in the early period of our sample, rentier income, as it's supposed to be usual in lots of countries, was mainly a flow of interest payments to rentiers from the government and from non-financial firms. But the interest income received from households throughout this period becomes larger than the interest income that rentiers receive from the government and from non-financial firms. So that's the story we're telling for the fall in the wage share of income and the increase in the rentier income share in that period. The fall in the profit of enterprise share is a conventional profit share squeeze, which in that period is not yet a profit squeeze because the level of capacity utilization still more than compensates the profit share squeeze, and the profit rates itself are still growing, or will still grow at least until 2009 or 10, depending on the estimate. And the government share increases in this period precisely because of the decline in interest payments by the government following the decline in real interest rates. In the following period, it's the crucial period in terms of distributive conflict in Brazil, because it's a period in which labor market tightening gets to its peak. We actually see the big strike wave I've mentioned earlier, but this increase in the wage share of income is no longer being compensated by increase in financial expropriation at that period. When you look at the data of household indebtedness, it stabilizes in that period, and the interest income paid by households stagnates. There are different explanations for that. Some people attribute that to government policy, to the fact that macroprudential policies that started being adopted in 2010 restrict credit extension. But some economists suggest that the level of indebtedness of households had reached such a level that it couldn't grow much further at that point, at the then prevailing levels of interest rates. So financial expropriation reached a limit in 2012, and at the same time, interest rates keep falling. So that's the period in which we have that attempt by Dilma's government to which is sometimes called the new macroeconomic matrix, in which they force down interest rates and depreciate the exchange rate. And not only you have a significant shift in monetary policy, with interest rates falling from nominal interest rates falling from something like 13 to 7%, if I'm not mistaken, in about a year. But you have also a significant pressure imposed by the government on private banks through the so-called battle of the spreads, when they put the public banks or they force the public banks to reduce spreads on their credit, on their loans, to try to force private banks to follow suit. So it's a clear shift in the government policy against rentiers, as the commodity booms had reached an end, the distributive conflict had come to the fore. The government takes a side, which ends up being very transitory and has to shift soon after, but it takes a side against the rentier, both through the battle of the spreads and through the shift in monetary policy. And in this period, the rentiers cannot compensate falling interest rate by increasing financial expropriation. So that's why between 2012 and 2013, we do see a significant rentier squeeze, which complements something that we found in earlier research, that it's the same period in which we see a significant profit of enterprise squeeze, because at that point the decline in the profit share is no longer being compensated by increases in capacity utilization. So profit rate starts to decline, and you have in those processes a very clear material basis for the unification of both factions of the capitalist class against government policy. And the story that follows is, let me just show you the data. So that's the decline in rentier income share that we see. The wage share increases here in the peak of labor market tightening. We do see an increase in profit of enterprise share, which is more to do with property income and some details that are probably distorting that data here that we could discuss later in more detail. And there is some decline in the same period in the government share that is related to the tax cuts adopted by the government at that period as well. Then, as we know, just after that period, Brazil went through this massive economic, social, and political crisis. So GDP falls almost 8% between 2015 and 2016, and there's a huge monetary tightening. This period not only eliminates completely the tightening of labor market, making unemployment jump significantly, but it also allows for the recovery of the share of rentier income, this time not because of financial expropriation, but simply because of higher interest rates. So the rentier share is recovered in this period mainly through increasing interest payments towards the rentiers from the government. If you look at the data here, we have something that may seem odd at first, which is an increase in the wage share, but that's kind of usual, as there is some process of labor hoarding that is typical during crisis. So GDP falls faster than the wage bill. So you see an increase in the wage share, but that's an increase in the wage share that is just a product of the death of the crisis. You see a significant increase in rentier income that reaches a level that hasn't been reached before. Profit of enterprise falls slightly in the crisis period, and most of the increase, both of the wage share and of the rentier share, is compensated by a significant fall in the government share that starts paying a significant higher amount of interest payments to the rentiers, and also suffers a big decline in its tax revenues because of the crisis. Then the last period, and I'm reaching the end of my presentation here because I'm aware that I'm probably talking for longer than I should, but I'll end very, very shortly. So the last period in our analysis is the period after the crisis, and the question that we pose provocatively at at that period was whether the coup against Dilma Rousseff in 2016 was a failure. A failure in what sense? A failure in redistributing income towards the capitalist classes, both rentiers and functioning capitalists and profit of enterprise. Because when we look at the data, what we see is that period was a period in which rentier income share declined and profit of enterprise declined, and government share increased, mainly because of the significant decline in interest rate that takes place again in this period and reduces interest payment by the government. But then the question is, how can we account for the increase in the wage share and the decline in profit of enterprise and rentier income share in that period? And the story here that we tell is the following. From the point of view of workers of the wage share, it is very clear in the data that there is a reduction in employee compensation. So the coup was not a failure in that sense. It did break the back of the working classes, reduced bargaining power of the workers, and reduced the rate of growth of wages. So that is all clearly observed in the data. But the point is that at the same time that that's taking place, there is a process of deleveraging from the huge indebtedness of the preceding period, and that, of course, ended up in the crisis. There is a process of deleveraging taking place throughout workers' households that lead gradually to lower income payments by households. And this appear in our data in the way that we define wage share as an increase in the wage share, because lower and lower share of wages, of a declining share of wages, are being channeled back through rentiers because of the process of deleveraging. Regarding rentiers, the surprising fact that this period of 2017-2019 is characterized by a decline in the rentier share, in our view, is probably a misleading indicator, because what is characteristic of that period, but we can't capture in our data, is that probably the crucial characteristics of rentier appropriation of income started to mimic more clearly what had been already the main forms of rentier appropriation of income in rich countries in context of very low interest rates. So that period is a period of very low interest rate in Brazil, unusually low interest rates, and in that period of unusual low interest rates, what we see is asset price bubbles. So in those years from 2017 to 2019, we see a huge stock market bubble in Brazil. We see huge housing bubbles in Brazil, and we do think that the decline in interest income that is observed in our data towards the rentier is probably more than compensated by asset price bubbles that are and by their and by the way that this channels larger and larger shares of aggregate wealth towards the rentier. But again, as our data for capital gains are limited, we can't really capture that process, and that would be an interesting task for future research. So just a few concluding remarks so that we can have a conversation about those topics. We think there are a few lessons from our exercise, which is admittedly preliminary, and there will be several ways in which we could expand on those findings and revise those findings and take that research forward. But we think it's an unusual first attempt to think about the distributive conflict in Brazil in this broader way by incorporating rentiers alongside workers and capitalists. So one of the lessons that we think we can take out of this exercise is a lesson for the theoretical literature on the tripartite distributive conflict. The the trajectory that we see of the distributive conflict in Brazil is very different from the one, for example, forecast by Kaletsky in his boom tire analysis. It's somewhat different from the suggestions by Jerry Epstein, and I think it points to the importance of thinking about this tripartite distributive conflict in peripheral economies subject to global liquidity cycles and so on and so forth. We could discuss that in more detail if that's in your interest. Another lesson is on the recent literature on income distribution in Brazil. There is, of course, a long-established tradition of measures of income inequality that suggest that inequality has declined in that last 2 decades up to at least 2014 in Brazil, and the wage share has increased. But as we are all aware, more recent estimates based on tax data following on the footsteps of the research by Piketty and his co-authors have found, especially the research by Marcelo Medeiros and his co-authors Pedro Souza, Rodrigo Rair, those efforts by Brazilian researchers of re-estimating income inequality in Brazil by looking at tax data have suggested that the income appropriated by the very rich has remained significantly stable. And then when we measure actual inequality, taking into account that level of appropriation by the very top, we tend not to see the decline in inequality shown by earlier works focused on household survey data. So we think that our results reinforce those recent findings that suggest that there was unambiguous declines in wage inequality, in wage disparity in the recent period in Brazil up to 2014. But the class determinants of inequality weren't put in question and weren't changed by the policies then implemented. So it was more of a process of redistribution within the working classes than redistribution between classes. And the fact that we see this continuous flow of income from worker households to rentiers reinforce those earlier findings. There is, of course, as well, lessons for the literature on the relationship between the current crisis in Brazil, political, economic, and social crisis in Brazil, and the intensification of class struggle. There is a lot of literature, mostly not by economists, looking at how the political crisis from 2013 onwards in Brazil is connected to an intensification of class struggle, an aggravation of class struggle. And with our data, we think we can provide some basis for understanding that aggravation of political struggle with our findings about the rentier and the profit squeeze. And last comment, we think that our data our research results provide some cautionary tales for both proponents of debt-led growth. There are a lot of people that have high hopes for unleashing process of acceleration of growth through new waves of credit creation, and the current government is not entirely innocent of that attempt. They do. It's, of course, in political economy terms, understandable as, say, a line of least resistance to try to unleash growth without active fiscal policy, but just stimulating waves of indebtedness. But as we show, there are significant limits to fostering inclusive development and process of redistribution through debt-led growth. And another cautionary tale that I do think it's relevant is that in the context of the global North debate, because of decades of low interest rate policies in the rich countries, and the way that these very low interest rates led to asset price bubbles and to increase in wealth inequality and the distributional effects of quantitative easing and so on, part of the left in global north countries have started suggesting that it may be better to move to higher interest rate policies. So it's something that we may call, some people have called, a dear money left. Yanis Varoufakis, for example, has written a few pieces along those lines. And what we suggest is that the dominance of financial interests and rentiers is much more profound than simply over the level of interest rates. And the recent history of Brazil suggests that the rentiers can preserve their big share of income that they appropriate in both low interest rate scenarios and high interest rate scenarios by changing the forms of appropriation of income. And that to face the challenges of financialized capitalism, we need to think about broader reforms beyond just changing the level of interest rates. Well, those were the main things that I brought to you, and I'm looking forward to our debate. Thank you very much. I'm going to close it here now so you can go back to see you.
Thank you, Professor Fernando. It was very interesting. I now pass the word to Professor Oreiro for his statements. Professor, the mic is off.
Fernando, thanks for your very clear presentation. It makes me to thought on some issues, and I will begin with your conclusions. When you make a warning against debt-led growth, and I completely agree, not only in terms of economic policy, but I think that this has also implications for economic theory. The so-called Raffian supermultiplier models that became popular among heterodox economists in the last 80 years one are based mainly of them, the Brazilian version, which is Franklin Serrano and Fábio Freitas from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. The engine of growth in their models is basically consumer debt. So they have models that they try to show that there is a PhD thesis, I believe, that was supervised by Fábio Freitas that showed that debt-led growth will be stable in the sense that the debt-to-income ratio will not explode, but will stabilize at some level. But as I have told, my criticism to the Raffian supermultiplier, growth path that is based on consumer debt is unsustainable. You are giving to me political reasons for why it is unsustainable. Because, as you show in your article, the wage share net of interest income are being reduced in Brazil in the last years. And basically, the interest income that consumers are paying is the interest over consumer debt that they had on credit cards when they buy a house and so, but mainly consumer credit to buy consumer goods. So I think there is one reason for why that growth is unsustainable, and the more reason for why the Raffian supermultiplier, I believe, is a wrong path for heterodox growth models. But during your presentation, the first issue that appeared in my head was the nature of the financial income. You know perfectly that in a classical Marxist view, interest is not considered that added value, is a deduction from the profits that is only the added value is constituted only of wages and profits. From the Marxist point of view, profits is unpaid labor, but is value, is added value. But when you go to the neoclassical theory of income distribution, the relation between profit and interest is not so clear. During many years or many decades, profit and interest are considered synonymous. Vixel also use profit or interest rate as the same thing. Okay, but I think that the distinction between profit and interest rate appears with Schumpeter in his theory of economic development. Profit is the income that is as a remuneration for technological innovation. And also in Frank Knight, profit is the remuneration for uncertainty. So that's the first question. How do you think, in more broad terms, the nature of interest income? That's the first question. The second question is how you work, if you did in your article, was not clear to me, the income of some financial services. For instance, insurance, hedge operations, fees from securitization. Why I'm asking that? Because I think that insurance, for instance, is a genuine service made by the financial sector. You cannot think is an expropriation of anything, Even income from hedge operations, you need productive firms that operate international markets needs hedge operations to be protected against unforeseen changes in the exchange rate. It's a genuine service, so it's not expropriation of anything. So my question is how you deal with this special financial services that is not a rentier income because you're doing something. You're not just sit down in a chair and come on, make money, give money to me because I deserve it because I'm a banker. No, but these services are genuine services. They are really necessary for a capitalist economy to work. So, well, and I have a doubt about your empirical results. When you show your results for the profit share, productive profit share, productive share basically remains stable from 2010 and 2014. Well, but there is a problem with this finding, because if you see, for instance, the work of that guy from your university, Carlos Roca, he had a very interesting paper published, I believe, in 2015, showing that for the 300 largest non-financial firms in Brazil, there is a huge reduction of profit rate from 2010 to 2014. Since the profit rate is, by definition, the product between the income, the profit share, the productivity of capital, and capacity utilization. And we know that capacity utilization do not reduce between 2010 and 2014. Capital productivity is more difficult to measure, but so if there is a huge reduction in the profit share, the only possible reason is that there happens a reduction in the profit share. Okay, And these findings of Roca was confirmed in a recent paper of Adalmir Marchetti from PUC of Rio Grande do Sul with his co-authors, a paper that was published in the Brazilian Journal of Political Economy, and in which Marchetti analyzes the long-run behavior or long-run dynamics of the profit rate in the Brazilian economy since 1950 and so something until more recent time. And precisely in this, I checked during your presentation the data, and between 2010 and 2014, there is a reduction in the profit rate in Brazil. For me, is what explains the unsuccessful of a second term of Dilma Rousseff, because we have, from my interpretation, I have a paper on that journal. It's not Estudos Econômicos, it's the other from USP. I don't remember. But my explanation for the crisis, Brazilian crisis of 2014 to 2016, was basically a profit squeeze. You have a profit squeeze between 2010 and 2014, and this profit squeeze produced a sudden stop in investment expenditures in the second, third, and fourth quarter of 2014. And this caused a recession in the second semester of 2014. Then the macroeconomic policy adopted by Dilma government in 2015 by his finance minister Joaquim Levy amplified the effects of the sudden stop of investment expenditure. Of course, investment expenditure, we have also to consider investment of Petrobras, and also the car wash operation had an effect over investment expenditure of Petrobras, but it's not only this cause. I think that is a profit squeeze. So, how can you reconcile your empirical findings with this fact that we had a reduction in the profit rate, between 2010 and 2014? And last, I think when you make a provocation that the cap was unsuccessful because it was not capable to restore the rentier income. I think that we have to remember that from 2017 on, the short-term interest rate that goes down, and I think that's why rentier income does not recover to the previous level. And I think that it will be very interesting to see what happens with the rentier income in 2020 and 2021. Because the interest rate goes down to 2%. And then in 2021, there is a huge pressure in Brazilian media and the economists of the financial sector about the need to normalize the monetary policy, which means to increase the Selic rate. When we compare the behavior of the Brazilian Central Bank with the behavior of the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, we noticed that the Central Bank of Brazil start to increase the short-term interest rate much earlier than the central banks of developed countries, and very fast. It goes from 2% to 14% in less than a year. So it's very, when we look to the behavior of the Federal Reserve and the behavior of the European Central Bank, they started after us and much more slowly than us, even though inflation rates in the United States and the European Union had achieved more or less the same level of 12% that we achieved in the middle of last year, when the accumulated inflation in 12 months in July, I believe, was more than 12%. So I think that it would be interesting to see what happened with the Rentier income during this period. But this is my questions.
Can I go on and address them?
Yes, please do it.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much for the very interesting and challenging questions. Let me try to address each one of them. It's a pleasure again to be here and to debate those issues with you. I won't talk in detail about the super multiplier model, and I haven't been following that literature as close as probably you are, and I would suspect that they could react saying that any source of autonomous demand could be the driver of growth, and it could be public investment as well as that led consumer expenditure. But I do believe that in some of their work, as you mentioned, they've made that claim that led growth is feasible, advisable, sustainable, or whatever. And I do think that, and I'm in complete agreement with you that that's a dangerous direction to go for several reasons. So not only there is a well-established literature, post-Keynesian literature, but even in other quarters of the economics profession that have been claiming how process of consumer debt lead to increasing financial fragility, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the teachings of Minsky and our constant need to be in guard to the risk of endogenous financial fragility. So that's one thing to begin with. But on a more say political note, even if the process of financial fragility can be avoided, if we are trying to foster a process of inclusive development, which should be the starting point of any progressive attempt at economic policy making in a country with an obscene level of inequality like Brazil. If our goal is to not only to accelerate growth, but to make the fruits of that growth be evenly distributed, basing that strategy on that led growth is self-defeating to begin with, because it's well established across the world that higher levels of indebtedness for working class households work as a disciplining mechanism. If workers face high debt burdens, they are automatically with less bargaining power. They have much more to lose when they decide to get into industrial action, and their collective capacity to face the bosses, the employers in distributive conflict is diminished by the disciplining effect of that. So we need to be clear that that's maybe naive or just self-defeating attempt of economic policy by groups that are hesitant in facing the big challenges or the big obstacles towards inclusive development. The big obstacles to inclusive development is really redistributing wealth, and really in a country like Brazil, or in general in Latin America, is really changing the hugely regressive nature of our taxation system and changing structurally our labor market to reduce the huge downward pressure that the big share of informal workers impose on wages in general. So these big structural challenges are underlooked, and instead we say, oh, come on, we can just tweak some policy details because then people will get more loans, and with this will generate growth. Is a line of least resistance that is in the end self-defeating in terms of distribution, in terms of financial stability, and I agree with you. I think this is a point that is increasingly well established, both theoretically, if not by all, but by a lot of theoretical work, and empirically, because we now have lived through 3-4 decades of increasing process of household debt across the world, and we are living on the ruins of that process. So we have to take it into account. Nature of interest. I think that your suggestion of thinking about the distinction of profit and interest along Schumpeterian or Knightian lines interesting and probably promising theoretically, but our work is closer connected to the more conventional Marxian political economy approach, and the debate there is mainly the debate specific on the nature of financial income and financial profits. On that recent literature is mainly on whether we can still think of financial expropriation, or the financial income flowing directly from workers to the rentiers, as a mediated way in which financial firms are sharing a part of surplus value, or if those processes of financial expropriation are themselves reducing the socially established level of subsistence wage, in a way that the level of exploitation itself is increased. So financial expropriation is not only sharing a part of surplus value, but it's increasing the overall level of surplus value through an increase in exploitation that opens the way for them to appropriate a larger share of income. It's certainly the case that in this tradition, as you're well aware, value is created only by labor, right? Living or dead labor, and not by these ways in which surplus value is appropriated. That's just a different dimension of division of surplus value that is created by labor in the process of production. However, you do touch on a very interesting point, which is subject to a huge literature and very controversial literature within the political economy tradition that refers to productive and unproductive labor, and there's lots of economists in that tradition that do claim, as you suggested today, that parts of financial services can be thought as producing actual services, genuine services and values, and can be thought as part of the productive labor side of the economy, and not only as money capitalists appropriating a share of surplus value. You're right on that, as well as there's a debate on transportation, whether transportation is just appropriation of surplus value or is creation of value, and I think the majority view is that it is creation of value as well. The service of taking commodities from one place to another is also a kind of creation of value. So there is some, service sectors, financial or commercial services, that are also creating value, creating surplus value that is then shared with the money capital. So there are, I think you're completely correct. There are genuine financial services that should be accounted of, and you're right that we don't take that into consideration in our estimates, and we do incorporate in Rentier income things that are that shouldn't be there if we think Rentier income in that sense. However, I do think that that's not entirely a problem for our interpretation, for the following reason. If I'm not mistaken, the main determinants of the shifts in the trajectory of the rentier income share are the main issues regarding the distributive conflict. Are not you don't expect to see a big increase in the rentier income share or a big fall because suddenly the production of insurance services have changed dramatically. In those short to medium run dynamics, it's probably the big changes in wage income and interest income and interest rate that are determining the trajectory itself. So even though I agree with you that some income that is placed by us in the rentier income share shouldn't be there, that would probably change the level of our rentier income share, but wouldn't change a lot the trajectory and the interpretation of the trajectory, which is our main thing to understand how we can see how one group is losing and the other is winning in different contexts. I think that still remains valid. For those reasons, Dunhaupt and the German post-Keynesians, when they estimate the rentier income share, they actually put the whole financial system as productive labor in that sense, as part of profit, and leave just interest payments for the rentiers. But I think they go too far in that direction, because we know that not the whole financial system is value creating, right? But just a part of it. And finally, your last two questions on the issue of Brazil itself, right? So on the profit squeeze in Dilma's first government and on the changes after 2019. So I'm in complete agreement with you regarding the profit squeeze. My own work has been, my own previous work has been a long attempt to make that same claim, that the main determinant of the crisis of 2014 onwards was a profit squeeze. I got into a big dispute with the same Straffians that you were mentioning before. There is a paper by Franklin and Suma that is aimed precisely at criticizing this paper of mine and a paper by Adalmir Marchetti, because of course in the Straffian view of the world, profit rates do not matter, and the crisis is only because of the shift in economic policy. And in our political economy point of view, we do think that the profit squeeze that took place in that moment is crucial. But then is that in contradiction with the data that I presented today? Not entirely, but the difference is subtle. So in that earlier work that I did, and I published the Review of Radical Political Economics, I think in 2021, we do find a big and very substantial profit squeeze from 2009 to 2009 to 2014, and that profit squeeze, and that's an important point, that profit squeeze is partly due to a gradual and slight decline in capacity utilization, but mostly, you're right, to the decline in the profit share, but not entirely. The other big contributor to the profit squeeze in our finding is output capital ratio, or productivity of capital, which seems to be explained in our earlier research by the terms of trade shock. So the way that the end of the commodities boom impacts the price of capital, which to a large degree is still imported in Brazilian production, changes the output capital ratio in a way that seems to suggest that terms of trade and output capital have a very close trajectory in Brazil. We could go further to discuss these details, but our finding in the 2021 paper is that profit share and output capital ratio have very similar sizes in their impact on the profit squeeze. When we calculate, however, the profit of enterprise share for the current research, for the one that we're talking about today, we find a somewhat different result, but we don't find a different result in the conventional sense when we looked at the profit share. The profit share itself, that is gross operating surplus of the non-financial corporation plus a share of gross mixed income, did fall in our data from 2011 to 2014. However, there is a compensation which may be more of an accounting convention. We do try to explain it looking at the disaggregated data, but it's not very clear to us. There is a compensation in net property income. So apparently part of the multinational corporations reduced the amount of profits they were taking abroad, or there's some shifts in net property income that attenuate the decline in the profit, that compensate the decline in the profit share, and the overall profit of enterprise share that takes account of both things, the productive part and the net property income of non-financial corporations, seems not to fall. But we do think that that's more a result of the way that they were reacting at the financial side of their balance sheets to the profit squeeze itself, not that the profit squeeze didn't take place. But that's certainly something that we should explore further in future research. We have all the disaggregated data to try to make sense of that. There is, for example, something that distorts this data somewhat, because we have these big dividend payments that the government is doing from BNDES and from Petrobras for fiscal policy reasons that appear as net property income from these different sectors when they are just, fiscal policy maneuvers. So there are things to take into account to actually get to the more significant numbers and to make that interpretation more precise, to try to have a better sense of what happened to the profit of enterprise share in that period. And last, to get to your last point on after 2019, I know you are, keeping up a very crucial struggle against our hugely conservative monetary policy, and it's very important that you're doing that. And I agree with you completely. We didn't have data from this the specific national accounting data that we need for that research for the period after 2019. I think now we already have for 2020, but not from 2021 and later. But when we do have this data, I'm pretty sure we would find a huge recovery of Rentier share through the conventional means of Rentier appropriation in Brazil, right? Through huge increases in monetary policy. I do, however, think, and I agree completely with your interpretation of how incredible was that the central bank moved earlier than the central banks of the rich countries and much more forcefully than the central banks in the rich country. But I do think that we should move the discussion a little bit beyond just the level of interest rate and think about management of capital, of the capital account and capital controls, because however true it is, the story that you are telling, what we see is that in the last year, because the Brazilian central bank moved earlier and more forcefully than the other banks, the Brazilian currency was one of the very few ones in the world that appreciated in that period, and that had very, say, costly and controversial, but a somewhat disinflationary impact. So if if we really want to try to challenge our conservative monetary policy, I think we need to challenge the setting of interest rates, but also move to shield Brazilian monetary policy of the global financial cycle and think about capital controls. But I've already said too much, and I'll be glad to continue the discussion later.
Isadora, I believe there is a question from the audience.
Yes, we have a question from Lena Lavinas from the University of Rio de Janeiro. Fernando, thanks for your presentation. Question. I would say that the deleveraging of household debt in 2017 to 2019 is just a result of the sharp reduction in new credit concessions in 2015-2016. This was due to recession. Banks have cut credit supply very strongly. Access to consumer credit resumes in 2017, as the central bank data shows. The debt-to-income ratio upsticks rapidly as expected.
Can I reply?
Yes.
Well, it's a great honor to get a question from Lena, who is a great friend and is the great authority on the financialization of consumption in Brazil and financialization of social policy and all that. And I don't disagree with you, Lena, not at all. I do think that that this in the most recent paper that we wrote on with those results, we do included a graph on the debt service ratio and the debt available income ratio, and those processes are more clear in those pieces of data. What I do think I think that this process of the leveraging that you're right are due to the recession itself were reversed afterwards, but their impact on increasing the share of income flowing from workers' households back towards rentiers would take a bit longer to take place, and probably the fact that throughout that whole period we saw increasing pressure by rentier interests to increasing or to changing policy to unleash new waves of indebtedness were all attempts to expand and strengthen that reversion of the process of deleveraging and expand the financial expropriation. So we see, for example, that attempt last year to authorize crédito consignado from social transfers, and we have that much better than I do. We have attempts along those lines throughout that whole period, and as I was discussing with Oreiro just now, probably when we get the data after 2019, that will show in the data, and the rentier income share will probably have increased as a result of this new wave of indebtedness that took place afterwards. We're just trying to make sense of the fact that during the period in which rentier interests and the capitalist class in general were in power, from 2017 to 2019, that the rentier share of income is not increasing. But again, I think that is partly explained by the fact that it was in the process of recovering, and this recovery would take a little bit longer to appear, and also because probably they were adapting to this transitory low interest rate environment by compensating their forms of appropriation of income through stock market bubbles and house bubbles especially. But thank you, Lena, very much for your question.
Okay. I believe this is it. Thank you very much, Professor Fernando. Sergio Fornazier is also congratulating you for your presentation here in the web chat. There.
Sergio Fornazier is professor of economics at the Federal University of Goiás. is
Oh,
also a
nice.
member of our research group. So
Thank you very much, Sergio. It's a pleasure. Thank you all for the invitation. Thank you, Oreiro and Lena, for the very interesting questions. And I'm looking.
some people are asking for your paper.
Sure, I can. I think I sent it to you, but I can send it again, and you can share with the whole list. It will be a pleasure. The most recent version. So the earlier version is going to come out at the Cambridge Journal of Economics probably next year. But the most recent version, in which we have a more detailed discussion of the political economy, is going to come out as a chapter next year, but is available as a working paper of the MADE USP, the Research Center on Macroeconomics of Inequalities. But I can send you the links, and you can.
Thank you.
It would be great if you could
appreciate
share with the research group. I'll be looking forward to continuing this conversation. It's a pleasure.
Oh, remember that next year we have there will be the meeting of the European the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy that will be in Spain, Bilbao. If you're still in England, I think that deserves. And I'm research coordinator of the research area of developmental macroeconomics. So you can send a paper to my research area.
Oh, that sounds like a very good plan. It would be great. I've never been to Bilbao, and it would be great to.
Bilbao is fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think that it will be in September. In general, the meetings of the IEPI are on September, maybe first or second week of September. And Bilbao is a very nice place. You have the Guggenheim Museum, it's worth to visit. And Bilbao is one of the best food in Spain, maybe in the world. So I think that you will appreciate a lot.
Nothing beats British food, Oreiro.
Pardon?
Nothing beats British food. British food is a really good one. Yeah.
You know, a friend of mine, Gabriel Porcilli, who born in Uruguay, told me once that his father asked him, "Did you know why the British had made the greatest empire of the history of mankind?" And he answered, "No, I do not know." Well, is for have the opportunity to eat out of home.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good reason. Yeah. Yeah, but sounds like a very good plan. I'll look to make sure I'll pay attention to the call for papers for the.
I will send to you as soon as we have it.
Okay? Sounds great.
Well, then, thank you so much. This is the end of our webinar. Thank you for watching and for the attention. Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Professor.
Okay, Fernando, bye-bye. Isadora, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Obrigado, pessoal.